All right. Hello, everybody. This is Julie broadcasting from the Ogdensburg History Museum, and we have Jim Reagen, who is speaking to us tonight. Jim is a county legislator. He's the former editor of the Ogdensburg Journal. He was communications director for Senator Patty Ritchie. He is a local author, a man of many talents. He's the current owner of the Sherman Inn with his wife, Donna. Very busy guy, but he has agreed to speak with us tonight about Fort Oswegatchie and its role in the American Revolution. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim.
Well, thanks, Julie, and thank you for inviting me to come and talk about Fort Oswegatchie. It's an important part of Ogdensburg and North Country history that probably more than any other part of our history has been neglected, forgotten, and misunderstood. As someone who grew up in Ogdensburg and who has spent a lot is a period of time that people in Ogdensburg really have no idea what happened here during the American Revolution. In fact, I remember years ago talking to the New York State Historian's Office and asking them about Fort Oswegatchie, and they assured me that Fort Oswegatchie had never operated during the Revolutionary War, which gives you some indication of how much folks in Albany and downstate know about northern New York. But even some of our own historians, some of our past historians have said, "Oh, the history of the Revolutionary War period in Ogdensburg has been lost in history, and sadly, we don't have access to what happened." Well, the fact of the matter is that it really wasn't lost in history. It was an important part of North America's history, but the reason why it's so misunderstood and forgotten is because we were British during the American Revolution. If you lived in Ogdensburg during the Revolutionary War, you were a British subject and you wanted to kill George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Ben Franklin. And that is a part of Ogdensburg's history that probably most people in Ogdensburg have never really wanted to hear much about. And when they're studying the history of Ogdensburg, it's a portion of our history that they have tended to not focus on because it is one of those unpleasant truths. But what has to be remembered is that if you lived in today Ontario or Quebec, It was your history. The people who served at Fort Oswegatchie were the British regulars. They were the British or loyalist sympathizers who fought for the king, who stayed loyal to the king during the Revolution, and included many of the French from Quebec, what's now called Quebec, which was the main part of Canada in those days, because across the river was wilderness. And, you know, this had been settled by the French. The Abbe Piquet had built Fort La Presentation, and it had been a major part of French Canada, but then it was conquered by the British in 1760 when they conquered Canada. So by the time of the Revolutionary War, 15 years later, this was a important part of the British defense of New Canada. It was a major part of the supply line that the British used to supply all of their British forts on the Great Lakes and on the Upper St. Lawrence. So we here, the soldiers that were stationed at Fort Oswegatchie, were playing a key role in supplying all the British forts throughout the Great Lakes, and their service and their involvement in that effort played an important role in the overall war. But it also figured into some major events that we as Americans tend to forget, and it's important that we remember, especially right now, is that in 1775, the 13 colonies who were organizing in defense of their rights as Englishmen, and who had begun to organize an army after the events outside of Boston, decided at one point that they would invade Canada. And today we tend not to realize that there came a day where the American Army sent a couple thousand troops into what's now Quebec, Montreal and Quebec City, to help induce the French to side with the Americans and make Canada into our 14th colony as part of the 14 states to fight for independence in the American Revolution. And just as today, efforts to free Canada from the British over our history has never quite worked out quite the way a lot of Americans thought it would. And back in 1775, it did not end any better. However, a couple of important figures in Ogdensburg's history played an important role in those events, and I'm going to talk about them tonight. One of them is Captain George Forster. That's Forster, Forster, not Foster. And Captain Forster was a captain in the 8th Regiment of Foot, which was the traditional redcoats that we think of today, who had been brought to the North American continent by the British to defend a string of forts along the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence as part of their occupation of Canada. And when the Americans invaded Canada in 1775 and captured Montreal and took it over, and encircled Quebec City, and were holding the British Governor General and his troops, pinning them down for the winter. Sir Guy Carleton, the Governor General of Canada, sent a message to Captain George Forster and ordered him to, in the spring, in May, to launch an attack on the Americans and help distract the Americans in preparation for the Canadians and British to take back Canada from the American invaders. Now, you got to keep in mind that at this point, the Americans had a couple thousand troops in Canada. By some estimates, it was 3,000 to 5,000 troops, and George Forster had 50 men at Fort Oswegatchie. I apologize for that. And with only 50 men, the idea that he was going to be able to make a serious attack on the American army in the Montreal area was seriously in doubt. However, George Forster was an extraordinary man, and one of the important roles that he played here at Fort Oswegatchie was his relationship to the Oswegatchie Indians, who lived just around what we now call Ogdensburg. They were the original members of the Iroquois Confederacy that had been attracted here by the Abbe-Piquet, and at one time there was as many as 3,000 of them at Fort La Presentation. But after the British conquest in 1760, many of them had left and gone back to their original villages, but there was still a large number here at the mouth of the St. Lawrence and the Oswegatchie, and George Forster had an important relationship with them and with the tribes in the surrounding area. And it was his relationship with those tribes that he looked to bring together to have an impact on his orders to attack the Americans occupying Montreal. So there was also another person, a very colorful figure in Ogdensburg's history, who's very few people have heard of and very few people know much about. His name was Claude Nicolas Guillaume de Lormier, the Chevalier de St. Louis.
Woo! That's a long name.
That is a long name, and for those of you who aren't that familiar with French, the Chevalier is a knight, and the Delormiers, his father had served as the captain at Fort La Presentation during the French period, and Claude, as his son, had taken the hereditary title and as the Chevalier de St. Louis, which was one of the highest honors awarded by the French for military heroics. He was one of the many French aristocrats who, after the conquest of French Canada, had sworn an allegiance to the British Empire. And a lot of people have trouble understanding why the French swore that allegiance and why they had transferred their allegiance from their mother France to the King of France. Well, the British had made a very wise move. As part of their conquest of New France, they had told the French aristocracy that they would recognize their aristocracy and their rightful titles and the all of the privileges that the aristocracy received by, for example, their titles to their land stayed intact. Their right to collect their rents from their peasants who lived on their land continued. Their rights to require that the peasants do certain services for them a certain number of times of year were held intact. And so for the French aristocrats, the idea of, since they and their rights and their privileges had been guaranteed by the British, they could see a value in, being loyal to this new king that had conquered their country. And the Delormier family were no different. And they had decided that, since the British had not taken from them, and the British had also guaranteed their right to their religion, which meant more than what we think of today, because the church, the French church, Catholic Church in Quebec, was not the church that we know today. The church in those days also had the rights to require tithes from the peasants, had a whole host, in fact, they had total control of some communities in terms of making laws and handing out properties and even licenses on whether or not you could operate a tavern in a particular community and where. They were a feudal government all of their own that operated in tandem with the French aristocracy. So Montreal was controlled by the Sulpician missionaries, and they had ownership of the city of Montreal. And so it was when the Americans arrived and had captured Montreal and had encircled Quebec City and were attempting to convince the former French officers and soldiers to join the American army, there was a great deal of skepticism by the French about the value of joining this revolution, because this revolution did not recognize the idea that if you were born to a certain family, that by the very nature of that birth, you were better than everyone else. That you had the right to require your peasants to cut trees and supply them to your estate, on certain occasions of the year. And, the idea that the church had this kind of feudal power was something that the American invaders particularly just detested, because they were all Protestants from Protestant colonies who believed that the Roman Pope was a danger to European civilization, and the idea that they were going to be in league with these Catholic priests and bishops and these French aristocrats, a lot of the Americans had a real problem with. And it was that hostility between the Americans and the French and the church that undermined this whole effort to recruit the French to join this American Revolution. So Claude Delormier had fought on the French side during the French, what we call the French and Indian War, and when the Americans invaded, he had picked up arms to defend New France from the American invader, and he made no bones about it in Montreal, where he lived. And eventually, during a meeting of a lot of the French aristocracy at one of the churches, he told his colleagues and friends that none of them should be joining this American Revolution, and that they should stay loyal to the king, who they had sworn their loyalty to after the conquest. And when the American commander, General George Wooster, got word of this, he ordered that Claude be brought in front of him, and he demanded to know whether or not Claude had made these statements. And Claude, being an honorable man, looked him in the eye and said, "Oh yeah, yeah." And I said a lot worse, and frankly, I argued that none of us should accept your offer of becoming officers in your army and fighting alongside you and giving up our allegiance to the king. And I said all that. And General Wooster was furious. And he told Claude that he should consider himself under arrest, and that he was probably going to end up in a prison ship for the rest of the war, and prepared, gave Claude a day or so to get his belongings and get his affairs in order, as gentlemen did during that time. And when Claude told some of his friends about, what had happened in his conversation, a young woman who was half Indian and half French, or actually half English, because she'd been taken prisoner by the Indians during the French and Indian War and brought to Canada and adopted into French and Indian society, decided that she could not let Claude go to the prison ships. So she conspired with him and dressed him up in Native American garb, and got a wagon and personally drove it with him in the back of the wagon, dressed as an Indian, and drove it to the gates of Montreal, where the American troops were checking people coming in and out, and explained to them that she had to go on an errand to see some of her family. And when the soldiers took a closer look at Claude, Claude pretended he was drunk and began, saying things, and the soldiers decided that he was just another drunken Indian, and they were able to escape through the gates of Montreal, and she drove the wagon to nearby village where he was able to meet up with friends, and together with with one of his friends, they headed for the St. Regis Indian, what we now call the St. Regis Indian Reservation, on their way to Fort Oswegatchie. And they made this daring escape during the winter months, and she returned to Montreal, and they never figured out that she had played such an important role in helping him escape. He later married her after the war, and they had several children together. But when he arrived at Fort Oswegatchie, he had also been given the same orders by General Guy Carleton to help Captain Forster in the spring attack on the Americans. And he went off to see some of the other tribes and to try to recruit more of the tribes to join the effort that they were going to make in that May against the Americans. So that May, Claude Delormier and Captain Forster led a force that had begun to acquire numerous other groups from Fort Erie, the Niagara Falls area, and Indian tribes in between, who sent various groups to come and help their allies, the British, during their time of need. And they put together a force of almost over 300 natives, 100 Canadians, 50 British soldiers from both Fort Oswegatchie and from some of the other detachments that were spaced on the St. Lawrence. And as they traveled down the St. Lawrence, heading from Montreal, all these groups coalesced together to join Forster and Claude in what appeared at the time to be a real long shot attempt to attack the Americans, because the Americans had a fort at what was known as the Cedars, which was about 30 miles this side of Montreal. And the Americans had built a fort and had 400 Americans in that fort. And Forster had made the decision that he was going to capture that fort with his small band of regulars and his large band of irregular natives, and the Canadians who had come to join the effort to try to drive the Americans out. And what the purpose of their attack was to distract the American forces. The British knew that as the river opened up in the spring, as it does, from when it's frozen over during the winter months, once the river opened up, that eventually new British troops would be arriving from London. And what the British High Command wanted to see done was to distract the American forces at Montreal to a threat from inland, so that these other forces could come up the mouth of the St. Lawrence River to free Canada from the American invaders. And that if Forster could create a big enough threat that would provoke the Americans into thinking, oh my God, there's an attack coming from the inland, they could create enough confusion within the American lines that the Americans would be split, and they would have a better chance of getting their ships in to fight on and to free Canada from the Americans. Well, the first step, of course, was to capture the Cedars. And with 400 Americans inside this wooden fort on the St. Lawrence, and such a small force of regulars and a large number of Indians, the chances of being able to do that posed immense difficulties. However, George Foster and Claude were not the least bit concerned. They believed that they brought a lot to this effort to do their duty and to attack the Americans, and that the Americans were poorly disciplined, ill-trained, and not a terribly effective fighting force. And but one of the problems was that Claude and George had completely different ideas on how you go about doing these things. The Claude was, let us say, had very little formal training in warfare, and his idea was, all right, we've got 400 Americans in this fort. Me and the natives, we will charge it, climb the walls, jump over the walls into the fort, and then shoot and slash our way to victory. And Captain Forster, told them they thought that was, a great idea, but before they did that, they might want to try another approach. And Claude was totally unimpressed with Captain Forster's less aggressive approach. But Captain Forster, announced to the Americans inside the fort that he had them surrounded, and that, he was in command of a large native force, and that the natives were not under British discipline, and that if the Americans did not surrender, that he would have trouble controlling the natives, and they might just very well go and attack the fort. And once they were inside, the Americans could expect nothing but bloodshed, and that the natives had a track record of barbarity and savagery toward prisoners, that sometimes they were not afraid to roast them over an open fire and peel their skin off, and sometimes eat them. And the Americans inside the fort found this whole concept of being surrounded by these savages who at any moment could be turned loose on them. And as far as they could tell, there were no reinforcements coming, and their commander, a Major Butterfield, was terrified. He'd been left there in command. His commanding officer was heard that the British might be coming, and became ill and had left him in charge. And the more he thought about, and meanwhile the natives were surrounding the place, and they were howling at night and making savage noises and drumming and in those days, for many of the New England people, they'd heard stories of what the early settlers had gone through in warfare with the natives, but they had not really faced much of it themselves. But they were well aware of some of the worst things that could happen in this kind of warfare with the natives, especially because only 14 years earlier, during the French and Indian War, it had happened. And many of them, had family members, and many of them had actually served in the war as well. So a lot of them were terrified, and after a great deal of consideration by Major Butterfield and his officers, they had a discussion and said, no help is coming. This could end badly, and Captain Forster, sent word to them and said, "Look, I'm having more and more trouble controlling these my allies, and I can't, I can't promise you that if you don't surrender very quickly, that I'll be able to have any control over them at all. And if you bring this on, that they attack the fort and they're successful. If they're successful, it could end very badly for all of you. And I can't control them. I can't promise you that I'll be able to control them. I only have a small force of of my regulars, and let's face it, you know, we're really not gonna fight and die against our own allies if you are foolish enough not to take this offer and surrender. And so the Americans inside this fort decide, yeah, I think we'll surrender. And without a shot fired, and even though they had over 30 days supply of food, they surrendered without firing a shot. And Captain Forster and his men took them prisoners. That night, the natives got a little out of control, and 4 or 5 of the Americans fared badly. Many of them had their belongings stripped from them and their clothing stripped from them. Major Butterfield lost most of his clothes, and Captain Forster had to find some clothes for him. According to some of the accounts that I've read, at least one of the prisoners was sort of taken off and roasted over an open fire and may have been eaten. But the rest of them were okay. But they got word that there were 100 soldiers coming as reinforcements from Montreal, and Forster and Delormier were able to surround those reinforcements and capture another 100 prisoners. So at this point they had 500 prisoners, and no way to feed them, no way to take care of them, no way really to protect them from their allies, who really felt like everything that they'd been able to steal from the fort was not enough compensation for all that they'd risked. And meanwhile, Benjamin Arnold, we today think of him just as the traitor in the American Revolution, but early in the war, he was an American hero, and he had played an important role in the attack on Montreal and Quebec City, and had distinguished himself as a brave and brilliant officer. He was leading a large force of a couple hundred men to the rescue, and when he arrived across the river from where all this was taking place, Captain Forster sent him word and said, if you attack, I won't be able to control what happens next. I've got my native allies, and if you kill any of them, if you come across the river and attack them, I don't know what's going to happen to the prisoners. They pretty much have them at their mercy, and I'll offer you a deal. Keep in mind, he had no food for his prisoners. He had what was he going to do with them? Was he going to march them 120 miles back to Fort Oswegatchie, where he only had supplies for less than 50 men? I don't think that would have worked really well. But none of the Americans were really thinking through the whole thing. And, Forster said, I'll make a deal. I will release the prisoners to you, they have to swear that they will not take up arms against the British for the rest of the war unless they are, they'll be on parole unless they're swapped for a prisoner of equal rank. And, you know, if you do that, you can save all their lives and take them home, and you know, we'll go on from there. And Arnold really wanted no part of that. He really wanted to attack the Indians, but with the Indians mixed in with the prisoners, it was clear that there would be a great deal of bloodshed both among the natives and the American prisoners who, you know, were pretty much at the mercy of the natives. And so after a great deal of consideration, he decided to make this agreement that he would recognize that he would take these American prisoners and their parole, and that the American government would swap them for British, and in the meantime these Americans would not fight in the war until such time as they had been traded for prisoners of equal rank. And so the deal was done, and Arnold freed the Americans and brought them back, and George Foster and his troops left with the natives, and meanwhile the ships had arrived over toward Quebec City, and 10,000 British had arrived in Quebec to go to war against the Americans. And Forster had, with his small band of British soldiers from Fort Oswegatchie, had successfully achieved what he'd been ordered to do. He had distracted the Americans from it, and the British Army had arrived, and the Americans were fleeing, heading for Lake Champlain to escape Canada, and the tide of the war in Canada had turned, and Forster was a British hero. But not in the U.S., or not in the 13 colonies. The Americans saw him in a completely different light. They saw him as the worst kind of barbarian, the worst kind of war criminal. They felt, had brought these unreliable, savage allies, and had put the Americans at risk, and threatened the worst kind of barbarities on them, and that this was just not how civilized soldiers conducted themselves during a war. And it was, you know, the American colonies and the American Confederacy just felt that, George Forster was a terrible person who had violated the Christian norms that were expected of officers during a time of war, and the idea that he could threaten and allow natives to do these barbarities was just unforgivable. And I think it's important to know what some very important people thought. Thomas Jefferson, some of you may have heard of him. A week and a half after the publication of the Declaration of Independence, July 15th, 1776, he's in Philadelphia. He writes a letter to Francis Epps, and he writes, "Our army from Canada is now at Crown Point, but still one half down with the smallpox. You ask about Arnold's behavior at the Cedars. It was this: the scoundrel, Major Butterfield, having surrendered 390 men in a fort with 20 or 30 days provision and ammunition enough to about 40 regulars, 100 Canadians, and 500 Indians, before he had lost a single man, and Major Sherburne, who was coming to the relief of the fort with 100 men, having, after bravely engaging the enemy an hour and 40 minutes, killing 20 of them, and losing 12 of his own, been surrounded by them and taken prisoners. Also, General Arnold appeared on the opposite side of the river and prepared to attack them. His numbers I know not, but believe they were about equal to the enemy. Captain Forster, commander of the king's troops, sent a flag over to him, proposing an exchange of prisoners for as many of the king's in our possession, and moreover informed Arnold that if he should attack, the Indians would put every man of the prisoners to death. Arnold refused, called a council of war, and it being now in the night, it was determined to attack the next morning. A second flag came over. He again refused, though in an excruciating situation, as he saw the enemy were in earnest about killing the prisoners. His men, too, began to be importunate about the recovery of their fellow soldiers. A third flag came. The men grew more clamorous, and Arnold, now almost raving with rage and compassion, was obliged to consent to the exchange and 6 days' suspension of hostilities. Forster declaring he had not boats to deliver them in less time. However, he did deliver them so much sooner as that, before the 6 days were expired, himself and party had fled all out of reach. Arnold then retired to Montreal. You have long before this heard of General Thompson's defeat. George Washington, some of you may have heard of him. He wrote, right on the same day, on July 15, 1776, he wrote about the inhuman treatment to the whole and murder of part of our people after their surrender and capitulation was certainly a flagrant violation of that faith which ought to be held sacred by all civilized nations, and founded in the most savage barbarity. It highly deserved the severest reprobation, and I trust the spirited measures Congress have adopted upon the occasion will prevent the like in the future. But if they should not, and the claims of humanity are disregarded, justice and policy will require recourse to be had to the law of retaliation, however abhorrent and disagreeable to our natures, in cases of torture and capital punishment. George Washington. The Continental Congress decided in their infinite wisdom, being far from where all this took place, that they had no obligation to recognize the agreement that had been made between the Americans and the British for the release of the American prisoners. So they told the American prisoners who had been released that they could go back to fighting against the British, and that because Forster was such an inhumane and savage and bestial person who had no regard for Christian behaviors, they did not have to follow what they promised. Now, later, Washington, as he became more aware of the facts surrounding the case and how Forster had personally intervened to save a lot of the lives of the American soldiers, realized that Foster had done his best and actually had pulled off quite a accomplishment at a time when he was heavily outnumbered and working with very little, and Washington urged Congress to agree to what had been promised. But I think it's important to know that these two men, George Forster was an important British hero during the Revolutionary War, and at a time when the British needed a hero, at a time when the British morale was down, when they were facing the Americans, and the Americans were celebrating victories. George Foster had challenged the odds and shown what a small force from Fort Oswegatchie could do. And this was just one of a host of things that happened over the years of the American Revolution, because a lot of important figures in British and Canadian history served at Fort Oswegatchie and played an important role in the Northern War of the American Revolution. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for having me here. Thank you to Julie and the Ogdensburg History Museum and its officers and board for their hard work in preserving Ogdensburg's history. I think if we take away anything from this little episode in Ogdensburg's history, it's that history happened here, and it's our job to remember it and preserve it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.